Chapter 1. The Flats of Ballymun, Dublin, 1969. The boy watched the fight from behind a huge rock. Swords clash. The man in the green suit jumps back. It was a fence to the death. Then Robin Hood charged into the duel, holding tight to a smile in the face of terrible danger. A brilliant light burst upon them, blinding the Dark King, while our champion sprung into the air, pinning him to a tree. Little John arrived on a brown horse and picked up the lad from behind the rock. Meanwhile, Robin Hood stripped the king of his cloak and they rode off into the sunset. Joseph, my twin brother, and I sat on the floor clapping when our hero saved the day. We stayed there until Ma turned the telly off and the black and white picture decreased to a dot. "Come on, it's time for bed," Ma said, picking up the scattered cushions from the floor. We rose and walked along the hall, clasping Da's hand. "Good night. Don't forget to say our prayers," Ma shouted. "Okay," we hailed in unison. "Da, will you tell me a story?" I chanced while he took me in. "All right, but it'll be a short one. Are you ready? Once upon a time, there was a little boy." I smiled and rubbed my feet together when I heard little boy. I looked over at Joseph. He was fast asleep. "Da," he said, cutting in on a story. "When I get to be a big boy, I learn snorries and tell all the boys and girls snorries." "That's a good boy. But it's stories, George," Dad urged. "Snorries." "Grey," he replied. And before he could utter another word, I fell headlong into dreamland. An angry wind blew fiercely at the window above my bed. The curtain shifted as a peal of thunder ripped through the heavens. I shot up and just as quickly dived beneath the blankets. I lifted my head and stared at the walls, imagining they were closing in on me. The blast raged across the blackened sky, shaking the glass. I drew a long breath and disappeared, covering my chin so that my eyes could only be seen. It was the dead of night. The streets below were silent. Where was Robin Hood? Would he appear? I waited and waited, but he didn't come. Once again I directed my sights towards the ceiling. My lips quivered. The roaring noise terrified me. The rain blasted our 10th floor window like bullets. A mysterious shadow grew from a creeping hand to a hideous monster. Was it a monster or the big bad wolf? I flung back the blankets, fled by my sleeping brother, and reached the top of the hall. The walls moved, or at least that's what I thought, bringing me face to face with the bodiless Indian statues hanging above me. I swallowed hard, fell into a crawling position and stalled past it. My body trembled as the eyes on the statues followed my every move. The voice from the television came to me like that of a friend. I reached for the door. My hand took hold of the handle. There was a pause. I pulled it down. It creaked. I flung it open, and on seeing Da sitting in his chair, I flew straight into his lap. I was shuddering when Ma brought me a drink and wiped my cheeks. "You don't have to be afraid. It's all right," she said. She ran her fingers through my hair. Resting in Da's sturdy arms and Ma's reassurance, I felt safe. "I can count to 20, I muttered into Da's face. "I know, son," he said, rubbing my head. My eyes closed, and I drifted into a world of fairy tale adventures and childish dreams. Morning arrived. I lay there, in bed, counting numbers in my brain and talking to God the way the teacher showed us. She said God always listens to boys who tell him things. So I told him how my little brother spits out his food when he doesn't like it. Then I told him about scaredy monsters and asked, why did Robin Hood never turn up when you need him? The thoughts of the night that rushed through my mind, the darkness, the stillness of the room, and monsters trying to eat me. I turned my face into the pillow and prayed to God to save me from monsters who eat you at night. I looked at the ceiling and said, I can count to 20. The sound of flapping wings landing on the balcony awoke my brother. I realised this because he jumped and yawned. And when the yawning stopped, he leaped out of bed and fired back the curtains. Joseph, I said, taking my eyes off the black sky for a moment. Aliens took me away last night. I was there too, he replied, nodding his head. Were you? I didn't see you, I gasped, waiting to hear his version of events. Yeah, I dashed up a hill. There were loads of sweets and big teddy bears everywhere. I pulled my knees to my chest, drew the blankets to my mouth and hung on to his every word. Joseph padded around the room, expanding on his adventures with the visitors from the moon. When I cut across him, I walked up a hill too. There was a castle that had loads of trees outside, and the trees had big eyes and two mouths. Joseph stopped in his tracks and sat on the bed when he learnt about the gigantic eyes and two mouths. What happened next? I crept inside the door and saw the ghost who I sure was an alien. He said hello. I didn't say hello back. I kept running and running until I fell off the mountaintop, and then I woke up. Everything went quiet in the little bedroom. Then Joseph jumped and ran screaming, Mama, George is frightening me. The door slammed shut. For a tiny moment, the night vision came back. I saw a footpath, a river, and a crossing beside a bridge made from thick branches. Nearby, a sign said, Madsner's Farm. I passed over in a long short, no trousers or stockings. I carried a book under my arm. There was a wood ahead. The trees were old, beaten by time and bent with age. The fallen leaves created a carpet. Each leaf had unique colours. Tiptoeing along, heartwarming tunes accompanied me. However, the noise of the slamming door caused me to dive out of bed. Now, I was running, yelling behind Joseph, dragging the blanket between the streaks of light coming in from the early morning sun. The first person I saw when I entered the kitchen was Pat, our little brother. He was strapped to a chair and he was firing food around the place. Ma washed the dishes. Dad shaved in the bathroom. We could hear him sing. So I pushed Joseph and stepped into my favourite stool. The kitchen had a small window with lace curtains and a tiny vase filled with fragrant flowers. Ma said she'd close her eyes and imagine she was standing in a beautiful garden. Dad said it was good that she imagined it because there wasn't much hope of a garden on the 10th floor. I closed my eyes and pretended I was in the Doctor Who box. Dad said there's no point being boastful. The kitchen wasn't that big. Our family moved here to Ballymun in 1966 to the land of dreams, the modern world of the working class people. For the residents it was comfortable. Outsiders would see it in an altogether different light. The massive towers housed some 90 families each. 7 towers were erected in grey concrete surrounded by 4-storey and 8-storey blocks. The corporation's monument to the housing problem of the early 60s. Most of the tenants came from run-down tenement houses, entire households who'd lived for generations in place that the historians described as the city with the worst slums in Europe. Chapter 2. It was May 1971. The old radio sang a song called Where's Your Mama Gone? Joseph and I joined in while Pop played with a spoon, sending food beyond the kitchen floor. Dad whistled as he came out of the bathroom. Right, boys, wash your hands, face and teeth. You can't have any breakfast before your Holy Communion. Afterwards you can have a big tree. This is your big day, a wonderful day, Ma said with a smile. By 9:30, Ma fitted us into our new clothes. Now we are ready to go. Joseph and I left the flat and raced across the landing. We pressed a button on the lift. It went green, which meant it was working. That made us glad. Dad said he was going to the shop. He wore a grey suit and black shoes. He carried a raincoat over his arm. Ma arrived at the lift with Pat in a buggy, and as if by magic the door lift opened. She wore a smart blue suit and a big hat. Joseph and I dressed in the school blazer, short trousers and long white stockings. We even had the same black slip-on shoes and school caps that carried the logo. There was a glint of pride in Ma and Dad's eyes as we left and felt like big boys now. "Ah, you look smashing, Marie," a neighbour hollered from an open window on the second floor. Ma turned and waved. "There's a few shillings for the boys," said the same voice. We watched coins fall and land on the path as if from heaven. Joseph and I sprinting in different directions. Ma tried to draw us back. "Come on," Dad said as we divided the money and shuffled around and stuffed it in our pockets, planning what sweets we'd buy later. "Thanks, I'll see you later, Mary," Ma said, waving back as we moved on. "She won't see me later," I heard Dad say through the side of his mouth. We got to the church, walked down the aisle and found a seat. That wasn't hard because we arrived first. The benches must have been clean because the smell of polish was still very strong. The sun was streaming through the coloured glass. It was like the entire world was on fire outside and we safe like Noah and his family inside the ark. At the top of the church, a chubby-faced boy sat. He wore a long white dress and he rested his elbow on a cushioned chair. He jerked his head and gave out a little sigh that said he was bored before sitting down and fixing his gaze on us. "I met Mary O'Rourke in town last week," Ma whispered to Dad. "Yeah, and how's she keeping?" asked Dad. "Well, she's away from Tommy and back living in her mammy's house. There was terrible trouble," Ma whispered something to Dad's ear. Dad looked at Ma looked at Dad, they both looked at us, and we looked at them, while the boy in the dress stared at us all, so I looked towards Jesus, whose eyes seemed sad. I let my mind drift and thought of Susan, who lived in number 20 in another block. Last week she was in her kitchen, and I was there too. She went to the press, took out bread and jam, and gave it to her little brother, who said, "Ta-ta, Georgie Fitzgerald, would you like bread and jam?" "No, thanks. Me ma said I should never take anything from strangers." "Well, my ma said you should give nice things to strangers." I stood there and wondered which one of us was the stranger. I imagined how nice it would be to kiss her. The teacher's words about sin came rattling back. The priest made his way towards us. I bowed my head in prayer, wondering if he could read my mind. He bent to talk with Dad, who lifted his ear to listen to him, and Ma smiled, nodding in agreement. Big people always smile and nod when they meet holy people. They nod their heads, their chins, their hands. If the person is really holy, they give a little nod with their knees. Then they sit until another holy person comes along. Then the smiling and nodding starts all over again until the old people who sit at the back are fast asleep from all the nodding. The timber doors opened, creaking sounds sent an echo throughout the church. Families rushed in, pushing each other out of the way to get a seat. The bell rang. Everyone stood up and leaned forward. Then they knelt and they sat back down again. When the bell rang a second time, everyone stood up again. So that is how it went. Standing, kneeling, fidgeting, sitting and scratching. I heard a mother in front. "I'm telling you, Timbo, I'll bite the arse off you if you pull that hard again." All the mas and dads stood back while the kids stood out in single rows, our hands pressed together. The boys wore uniform while the girls were adorned like princesses. We watched the priest read the big word. My heart clung to me because I knew what would happen next. He handed me a little wafer and I swallowed it. For us, this was a big day. We received Jesus. Well, that's what the priest told us. So now we were holy. I'm holy, Joe.
No, I'm Holy Joe. Your name is George. Ma, George said his name is Holy Joe. Tell him I'm Holy Joe. Ma and Dad burst out laughing. Dad gave a little cough while the priest glanced sternly. But Ma couldn't stop. The bell rang again and we blessed our faces and left feeling all holy. Once we were outside, I ran along the concrete steps at the side of the school. I rested, tilting my head back underneath the summer sun that had made an immense appearance on a holy day. Like all young boys, I was new to life. The air was clean, everything was fresh. It was a joint adventure. But like all adventures, real and imaginary, there's always dark passageways laying ahead. Nobody gets to rest in the harvest of his dreams without first entering the dungeons of his nightmares. For this little boy, one just lay ahead. Chapter 3. The woman who sat on the chair in front of the butcher's shop was portly, with large shoulders and jolly cheeks. She looked haggard. She was like an old grandmother. "Ah, there you are," she said, pulling herself from the seat as we approached her. Before she did, she took a sip from a tiny bottle that she'd buried in her smock. Would you look at the twins, Marie? They're getting so big as trees," she beamed, while shading her eyes and surveying us from head to toe. I'm not kidding you, as big as trees." "It doesn't matter how big they get as long as they behave themselves," Ma replied, mildly disagreeing with the old lady. So I stole a glance at my reflection in the window and wondered what trees she was talking about. "It must be the ones Ma grows in that kitchen," Joseph answered, while both of us laughed right into our hands. She said to Ma in a whispering tone, "Now listen. Don't say a word, but me and him aren't even looking at each other." She crossed her arms and stuck her thumb out. "Me and him," said she to me Ma in the butcher shop. "We don't talk at the minute. I can't even look at him." That's terrible," said Ma. Ma always said, that's terrible, when she finds out that big people whisper about things. When people whisper, they gawk at me. They whisper and gawk and tell stories about people they can't stand to look at. Everything is said in a whisper. Thumbs get pointed this way and that. Fingers go every way and gawking eyes go my way in the big people's world where no one can say a word. "Now remember," said the woman in the butcher's shop, "Timmy Ma, don't say a word." "Right, what can I get you, love?" "A ring of pudding, a half-pound of sausages, and 6 lean rashers. Oh, and a dozen eggs." "Is Georgie in work?" inquired the old lady as she wheeled away from the counter. "Yeah, but he'll be home early today. He has a new job in Glasnevin." That's great," replied the woman, standing with her back to us. I jumped up on the counter and watched her swallow the last drop of the bottle. When she thought nobody was looking, she whisked the crumbs away from her smock, wrapped the food, wiped her lips, blew us a kiss. "There's a lovely bit of pudding. I know what's proper for lads with all that grown in them," she said. "She knows what's good for herself," I confided to Joe, both of us laughing while we waited for our lollipops. "There yous go, boys," she said, handing us lollipops. "What do you say?" Ma asked. "Thanks," we said, and off we marched out of the shop. A blistering blue sky blanketed the neighbourhood of Ballymun. The heat blanketed the balconies where we sat barefoot in our white shorts, licking our lollipops. Inside, breakfast was being prepared. On the table, there was plates of food with eggs, bacon, sausages and toast. The glass door with the narrow frame opened. It was Da. "Right, boys, your fry is ready," he said. He stood smoking a cigarette. His black hair shone in the sunlight. He gazed over the balcony, then he smiled at us. We smiled back. Da, the tall figure of a man who carried the look of a film star, was a warm-hearted with kind nature. A hero. We loved him, as we did Ma. a small, attractive woman who always had room for a laugh. If there was anything funny to be found, our ma would find it. As we rested in the harbour of our childish dreams, a voice from the neighbouring window interrupted. Did you make $1 million yesterday, lads? Never you mind, Danny, Dad said with a gentle grin. Go away out that, Georgie. That good boys, she remarked. The lace curtain that hung along the door moved. Dad switched his glance and noticed Pat. He picked him up and held him in the air, calling him funny names, the ones adults use when talking to babies. Ma called us from the kitchen, and Dad, Joseph and Pat withdrew from the sun and entered the flat. As far as the eye could see, there were blocks of flats. They were named the 15-storey towers after the 7 leaders of the 1916 Horizon. The flat complexes had 5 and 8-storey districts: Balbutcher, Balcurris, Coultry, Shangan and Stalogue, and the 3 4-storey districts, 2 of which were Shangan and Stalogue, the third being in Sandy Hill. The washing on the balconies and the bedding and hanging in the windows danced in the light breeze. On each side of the balcony there was a gap, and I could look out. Coughing rang from the pavement. Here, Fatser, bring down the pram. I've a pain in my arse lugging it around the place. I bowed and peered out and saw no one. I knew the voice. It was Mrs. Nobody's child. That is what the people called her. Her and Fatser lived in another block, but their relatives occupied a flat on the 2nd floor. Fatser was a likeable man who'd rub your head and call you kid. He sold things in town or on the streets, not from a shop, but from a pram. They sold everything from that pram. George, come in, Ma called. Then turning to Dad, she said, Mary was here. She asked if she could see the twins dressed in their new clothes. Dad threw his eyes towards the ceiling and nodded a silent yes. From the time of our birth, people would stop Ma and ask if they could peer in at the babies in the pram. Twins born into a world of recognition. A place of staring eyes and the bond of unity where individual can vanish. What's it like to be a twin? That's the question people have asked us all our lives. Well, what's it like not to be one? What I can tell you is that you feel unique, because wherever you go, you're the centre of attention. The downside of it is everyone in your world seems to take on the role of judge and jury in the comparison game. He's like his dad, or he's like his ma. Who's the clever one? Who's the dopey one? He's the taller, smaller, or fatter. The upside is that you've always got someone to watch your back. The term loneliness is a word in the dictionary, because from the moment of conception, you have a companion. Chapter 4. We visited our granny's house in Ballymun. We had 2 grannies and 2 granddads living there. Me dad's ma we called Granny. Me ma's ma we called Nanny. Our granny lived on Lally Road while our nanny lived on Deasy's. Our granny and Lally smoked cigs, and our granddad smoked the pipe, while our granddad and Deasy smoked players, and our nanny didn't smoke at all. Our grandparents on Lally were Patrick and Nellen. It was Tom and Bridget who lived on Deasy's. They were always happy to see us. Our world was plain adventure. At the top of Lally was a park. We'd have toy airplanes and we'd run holding and making buzzing sounds. Grandad Patrick was from Portlaoise, the birthplace of aviation in Ireland. The first plane made in Ireland was assembled in that town. So it was reported in King's County Chronicle in November 1909. Or so I was told. My granny talked to us while my granddad sat and stared. He'd stare and smile. He'd smile away to his heart's content when my dad talked to him. And me ma talked to me granny as she made a coddle, and we played on the floor while me granddad smiled for Ireland. Me granddad didn't drink tea from his cup, he sipped it from a saucer. Me granny kept her cigs in a bag under the chair by the fire in her house on Lally Road, Ballyferme. Me dad said the morning was young. I wondered if the night was old. So out we went into the front garden in me granddad's house on Lally Road. We ate these things he grew there. They were on long stems and tasted like gooseberries. We called goose gobs. Me ma said, don't eat too many of them. You might go do, laddie. You won't go do, laddie, me granny said. Then she looked at me granddad from Portlaoise, standing as tall as a tree, smoking his pipe. Yeah, he's the best children in the world, but don't eat too many. You might get cramps. Me auntie said she nearly went do, laddie, the day Joseph and I locked ourselves out on the balcony in our flat. She had a flat in town where she made nice chips. Joseph and I nearly caused her to go do, laddie, and me ma went up the wall. Big Paddy, I think some people called me Grandad. Our other Grandad was called the Black Rose. Me dad told me that Portlaoise had a prison. I saw the picture of a man in a magazine and asked me dad who he was. He told me his name was Al Capone. I wondered if he was in the prison in Portlaoise, where my Grandad, who was as tall as a tree, smoked a pipe and smiled for Ireland, was born. I asked me dad if Al Capone was in the prison in Portlaoise. He said, no, but Bonnie and Clyde are. So, if you're ever there, to watch out for them. He winked and smiled and gently pinched my cheek. So, with great excitement, I told Joseph how we were to watch out for Bonnie and Clyde in Portlaoise. We went up to the park with my uncle, and who told Pat to jump off his shed. He did, but he banged his head. So we went back to my granny's house with Pat with a lump on his head. Later, we kissed Granny and Grandad, and we headed for the number 79 bus. On the bus, Dad told us that before Portlaoise grew up, it had a different name. It was named after Queen Mary. Queen Mary, we said, as Joseph and I looked at each other, and Pat cried, but Ma felt Pat's head and said, the bump is going down. Ma gave him a lollipop she found in her bag, just to keep him quiet. Queen Mary, I thought. Queen Mary, Dad repeated. Yeah, Portlaoise is a county town of Laois in the middle of Ireland. It has a castle and a train station where your Grandad got the train to come to Dublin to meet your granny, who was from the Liberties. When your Grandad was a boy, he climbed the mountains, fought the bears, killed the giant, and caught the train from Portlaoise to Dublin to meet your granny in the Liberties. On the train, he waved to Bonnie and Clyde as they drove around Portlaoise in a lovely white car. Ma turned and said, George! It was like she was not happy with her dad's story, so he put his fingers to his lips and whispered, don't tell Pa, he's too young. We nodded. Chapter 5. I wondered about Bonnie and Clyde in Portlaoise, driving around in a lovely car and waving to me Grandad. Me dad said it was white. I imagined it. I wondered if they'd come to Dublin on the train me Grandad caught to meet me granny, who was from the Liberties. I asked me dad where was me Grandad Tom from. He said Swords, but he lived for years in Gardiner Street in a big house called the Tenement. He said Lord built that street. I couldn't believe it. Wow, me Grandad lived in a big house called the Tenement on Gardiner Street, owned by a lord. I was having a good time thinking about this as I trudged into the classroom to hear the noise of chairs being dragged. September had fled. It was Halloween. This was a special day. The teacher stood at her desk with her hands on the top of her books. A woman in a brown apron inched her way behind her. She was called the cleaner because everywhere she went, the smell of bleach followed her. I moved to my seat. We are being told creepy stories today. That's what the teacher said. We were no sooner at our table when she described Quasimodo, the man with the hunchback. After she finished telling the story, she narrated Another one about creeping monsters. I felt like crying, but I knew the boys might call me Mammy's boy or Sissy. So I stuck my fingers in my ears and counting lambs jumping over fences in my head. The door opened and in marched the Reverend Mother. We all stood. Be seated. The Reverend Mother would like the chance to speak to you for a minute. Well, boys, the Reverend Mother said, looking over the rim of her glasses. We never answered. We were too afraid in case we said the wrong thing that would leave us damned. After a moment of silence, she spoke again. Well, boys, Christmas is not too far off, so what I've done is I've brought in this box. I would leave it at the top of the class. I want you to do is to put a penny a week in for the poor babies in Africa. I wondered how the babies who lived in Africa could get the money from our table. She continued to tell us about the poor babies. I thought about the baby they call Rockabye Baby, the one that fell out of a tree. He must have been a poor baby from Africa, because I never saw a baby sleeping in a tree. I whispered this to Johnny, who sat beside me. He said he saw a baby stuck in a tree from across this block. Not only that, he said it was so far up the tree that the fire brigade had to come and get him down. Fat Billy, who sat behind us, chuckled. That was a cat, Johnny, you dope. Poor Johnny's face lit up like a Christmas tree. He was so embarrassed. It wasn't the first time I saw Johnny go all red. Last week, he went to the toilet all down his leg and left a big puddle on the floor. The teacher told us to fold our arms and go to sleep. I could not because of the smell. Fat Billy said it smelled like cats. I said I never smelled a cat. He said it did. I asked him when. He said he did not know. After the Reverend Mother finished talking, she left the room, leaving behind a large box of sweets for us boys. The teacher put her books down and handed them out one at a time. As she was about to sit down, I walked up to the top of the class and spat mine out. It sounded like popcorn popping when it hit the bottom of the bin right beside her table. Miss O'Brien screamed my name. I froze. She pulled me towards her with a ferocious jerk and rushed me screaming across the room. My feet progressed from walking to running as I tried to keep up with the long stride she took. The corner was dark and lonely. You could detect laughing eyes hiding behind tiny hands. There was no yellow brick road here. Go to sleep, the teacher cried to the boys. And in one quick movement, she turned her head back to me. So you don't like that sweet? She screamed. No, I replied. Ungrateful, ungrateful. God hates ungratefulness, she yelled. She walked to the top of the class, and when she returned, she had a hat in her hand. It was pointy with the word dunce written on it. She cowered over me like a shadow. Stand up, she cried. When I did, she crowned me with the pointy hat. Moving forward until our faces nearly touched, she exclaimed, "You're a dunce!" I could smell the perfume. It mingled with the bleach in the bucket. The one the cleaner left behind. Ma wore perfume. Not all the time, only on special days. Ma's was nicer. Will I be a dunce forever, miss? She paused and stared at me. Yes, forever, she snapped. I fell to the ground, shrank to the floor. She lifted me up with one hand and marched me back to my seat. Discerning the historical state I was in, she acted the way any cruel teacher would. She did nothing. Her remorseful voice ran across my thoughts. I can still see the infant and the teacher standing at her desk. The steely, clenched woman, her squinting eyes, her deadly letters scrawled on a hat. At the back corner, soaked in grief. If wisdom brightens a man's face and changes his hard appearance, what would the lack of it do? I stared out the window and watched the autumn leaves fall, wondering if man knew how long forever was. Chapter 6. Christmas is coming, the goose is getting fat. Please put a penny in the old man's hat. If you haven't got a penny, a halfpenny will do. If you haven't got a halfpenny, God help you. That's the song Fat Billy, Joe and I sang as we skipped in front of Ma and Pa a few days before Christmas. Fat Billy rolled up his sleeves and ran towards the shop. Once he got there, he pressed his nose against the window so hard he reminded me of Quasimodo, the guy the teacher told us about in our story. Look, it's the baby Jesus and cows. There's the choo-choo. Santa's bringing me, Billy shouted. Ma, can we look at baby Jesus? Can we, Ma? I asked. Okay, but only for a few minutes. We need to go home. Your dad's putting up the Christmas tree. So off we went with Pat shouting, Baby Jesus. The streetlights illuminated the night. The pavement sang with the clatter of foot soldier shoes. There was bells in the distance ringing over the shop's doors. The festive sounds are delight to our childish ears. We wish you a Merry Christmas. We wish you a Merry Christmas. We wish you a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year, sang the carol singers outside. To this day, I recall that evening. My gaze drifted. It was an odd thing to turn away my thoughts from everything around me, to dismiss the sharp lights and the childhood dreams of Christmas to come. I remembered the school, the storytelling, the hand of the teacher, the lady patronising a boy in her polite and deadly way. Ungrateful, ungrateful. God hates ungratefulness, she had yelled. I scorned the day that a teacher put that horrible hat on my head. I could still hear the boys laughing and sense the sorrow in Joseph's heart. Then I saw my friend Tim's ma. Tim sat across from me at school. Even as a child, he understood that for many December was a joy, but for others it was a burden. There was a man at the crossroads holding his child's hand. A woman on a box is holding out her own. Christmas was a terrible hardship for her. The waiting hours were longer than Puzel's hair. So there was Tim's mother sitting on a box, while his father yelled in a pub, and barely a few feet away, my school friend Tim peered over a corner while the carol singers sang, Christmas is coming, the goose is getting fat, please put a penny in the old man's hat. If you haven't got a penny, a halfpenny will do. If you haven't got a halfpenny, God help you. Fatser and Mrs. Nobody's child inched their way across the street. Their voices were in full flight as they sang along with a rattling pram. The pram was filled with presents that not even the poor black babies would have wanted. There's the baby Jesus, look at there's his mammy and his letting on Daddy, Billy said. He pointed to each one in the shop window. Oh, I'm telling on you, you said of course. Ma, Billy said of course. He did, Ma, Joe added. I thought Billy might run home. I'd hoped he would in case he fell. Billy's ma lived in fear of him falling. Or of falling on a Sunday, or a Monday, or any day for that matter. Billy, don't fall. This is Sunday. Billy, don't fall with those shoes on. Billy, if you're going to fall, take your pants off. Yes, it's safe to say Billy's ma did not want to see him fall. Ma threw us a look, the one big people have when they feel sorry for someone. Stop telling tales, boys. Santy's keeping his eye on you. Then she turned and talked to the shopkeeper. A man emerged from a shop. He walked with his hands cocked back, his coat swinging wildly. He addressed Ma with a courteous smile, but his next words were harsh. Right, Billy, come on. It's time to go home. But Dad, look, there's the choo-choo Santy's bringing me, he said, with his face still stuck to the window. Yeah, ask him to bring me one as well. Come on, let's go. Okay, Dad, he said, and off they went. Billy didn't hold his dad's hands, but he turned and waved. Right, boys, let's get the rest of the messages, Ma said. We did. And when she finished, we headed back to the flat. Wow! Look at that, Joe shouted when we walked in the door. It was the biggest tree in the world. Yeah, it's even the biggest in Ballymun, I said, shouting over the radio, which started singing again. Dad loved the song, so he left the tree and danced with Ma. She laughed more when Joseph and I joined in as Pat clapped and bounced up and down in his pram. Dad went back to the tree, telling us how he cut it down by himself. He told us he fought off 2 big bears and ran with the biggest tree in the world. Joseph and I stood with our mouths open wide, and we were about to cry when he tiddled us, and he said that he was only joking. It was 1 bear. I felt thrilled because Santy was coming, and it was Jesus' birthday. I thought about Billy and his father wandering under the peering eyes of the giant towers. So I inched into the bedroom and asked God to tell Santy to bring Billy a choo-choo. Christmas Eve arrived. After our bath, we put on our new pyjamas, the ones me Auntie May got us. We kissed Ma, Dad, Pa and each other. Then we scrambled into bed, talking about toys and sweets as we marked the second last X on the calendar. Later I got out of bed and stared out the window, hoping to witness Santy's coming. I wanted to see the sky light up. I needed him to tell me I wasn't a stupid boy. I could ask him if shocking holy Jesus was mad at me. The teacher said he was because I spat out a sweet and made the bucket go pop. I never did get to meet him, but I saw the stars. Pressing my hands together, I wished Jesus the happiest birthday ever. I jumped back into bed. The dawning of Christmas morning ascended on us, and we were there, and there was no more X's left to mark on the calendar. Joseph tugged me and then pulled back my blankets. George, Santy's been here, he cried, his voice full of excitement. My heart jumped for joy when I remembered what day it was. We stood in silence. Then the silence broke into excitement. Joseph walked out of the room first. He looked back at me when I reached the sitting room door. Opening it ever so gently, he peeked in. Our little eyes could hardly take in what they were seeing. There were boxes of toys neatly stacked. Along the floor were annuals, the dandy, the beano, resting on selection boxes. From the moment, a memory was framed forever in our minds. We stood with our hearts filled with the most excitable, incredible feeling. In the background, we could hear Dad getting out of bed. The sound of shuffling feet coming down the hall was audible. We looked at each other. Then we went about opening presents like boys who had found hidden treasure. Happy Christmas, boys, Dad said, opening the door. Happy Christmas, Dad. Look what Santy left us. Well, these must have been good boys, he added, sitting in his chair. Just then, Ma arrived, with Pat dangling in her arms. Hey, Ma, it's Christmas, I shouted. Oh, look what Santy brought. Look, George, he must have been hungry because he ate all the pudding and it's gone. Ma helped Pat crawl through the rubble of boxes, guiding him to his pointed destination. The lights on the Christmas tree lit up the room. Songs were playing on the radio as we unravelled the boxes. The atmosphere was electric. Suddenly, Ma asked a question. George, Joseph, what are in those boxes over there? It was our bikes. We'd been so excited that we forgot about the very thing we asked for. That Christmas we spent in 64 Eamon Kent Tower, Ballymun, is a time to look back on with great fondness. Ma gave me a book. It was filled with pictures, a teacher for boys who had learning problems. I smiled and kissed Ma on the cheek as she came close. The night sang silently, with not a sound from beneath the block. Ma, go to sleep, son. Dream big dreams. Dream. Never judge a book by its cover. I know, Ma. The words escaped. They slipped between my lips and danced out into the night sky. The book is in me. The book is in me, Ma. And chapter 7. The radio talked to us. It talked a lot, well, mostly to Ma. In the morning, the radio chatted about everything, especially Malin Head. The radio was a fan of the weather and Malin Head. But one morning, it spoke about something else. It talked about bullets. Yes, it talked about bullets and a place called the Bogside and an area named Derry and a Sunday that was forever called Bloody. But from then on, the radio talked about bombs and bullets as much as it did about the weather in Malin Head. The year is 1972. It's a Saturday afternoon. The summer has arrived. There is a youth. He's wandering and listening to music. It's American music rising from a radio on the second floor. I knew it was American music because my dad said it was. The youth jumps from the curb, rolls his shoulders back, places his hand over his mouth and roars. He aims his voice at the balcony with the radio. Here, kid boy, you coming now? His cry is like that of a vendor. He walks between the sunlight and the shadows, takes a few drags on a cigarette and flicks it away. When he gets no answer, he marches off. He was wearing a t-shirt and bell-bottom jeans. I pulled up the window and watched him cross the playground. Closing it, I left the flat. Someone had jammed the lift, so I took the stairs. There was mud on the stairs and writing on the walls. The air was heavy with the smell of urine that wafted up from the basement. Women stood with prams and screaming babies. Their cries echoing throughout the block. I avoided the dirty steps. I did it by jumping over them, moving with ease. I showed how acquainted I was with mucky steps and crying babies. We played at the entrance beside the huge corporation bin. No boy from the houses or other flats violated our sanctifying playing ground. Here, look out! A girl shouted as a bag of rubbish shot from the third floor, splashing onto the streets. The glad morning light shone. The dazzling sunbeams exploded on every pane of glass, penetrating the drawn curtains to open the eyes of the sleepers. Then came the traffic of foot soldiers. A woman walking ahead held her child's hand. She gazed at Fatser, resting on a box, playing with his spoons, his enchanted trade, shipwrecked by modernism. The birds on the balconies eyeing the humans in their concrete boxes in the sky. Those bright-eyed creatures, fresh from heaven, listening as the girls in the playground sang. Two little dicky birds sitting on a wall, one named Peter, one named Paul. Fly away Peter, fly away Paul, come back Peter, come back Paul. In front of our tower, the older boys, who wore tweed caps had smokes hanging from their mouth, played more adult games. They'd stand a few feet away from the path in a squatting position, tossing coins. Barney, an old man who lived on our block, sat in the middle of the boys who were arguing over the money. The elderly man had a disorder. That's what the grown-ups said. Poor Barney has a disorder. He was not feeble in his body, so the disorder was in his head, his mind, his jailer. Barney often sat on a chair with his back to the wall, always amused by the children. He'd smooth your hair back with a gentle touch, his eyes glistening with tears. Tears lodged above his eyelashes, but never moved. They did not fall on his cheek or the ground, but stayed there. Poor Barney has a disorder, I heard him say. Little Georgie, will you bring those cigarettes over to Mrs. Murphy? He said, pointing towards the woman standing at the other block. He wore a Faldunigan jumper, or one very much like it. In those days, the mas and das wore swirling colours. There were psychedelic shorts for the men, and the women wore short skirts. The 60s exploded in colour in contrast to the 50s. As the 70s came, so did long hair and flared trousers, and by 1973 our fresh-faced tower was growing old. Quickly. Would you like a smoke, Mick? Barney said to his friend. Not a puff, said Mick, waving his palm in the air. Here, have a smoke, will you? Barney shouted. Knowing Mick's tongue said one thing, but his eyes said something else. Go on then, he muttered, winking at me. Right, son, off you go. She'll be there before you're back, you know it. And when you get back, I'll have a reward for you. So off I ran with the cigarettes in hand and the reward on my mind. Mrs. Murphy was standing with her arms folded, talking to another woman. They were middle-aged, heavy women, with scarves pressed on their heads, even in the blistering sun. Goodness gracious, Mary, Mrs. Murphy said, leaning back and looking up at her window. Do you know where he's up to now? Mrs. Murphy asked, tapping Mary's arm. I saw him earlier over at the shops, Mary cut in. He's up to no good, let me tell you. He was wailing up at that flat this morning, looking for that git boy, Mrs. Murphy added. I know. Sure, I heard him. I'd say his arse is sore after the hiding his dad gave him, Mary replied with a sigh. She's always funny in the head. His father, that fella of mine, is the same, as was old Mick, the granddad. Do you remember Mick, Mrs. Murphy? I do indeed. Well, that boy of mine is every bar to Mick. There wasn't a bar he didn't stand behind, and I'm not talking about pubs. She nudged Mrs. Murphy and they laughed. After being there what seemed like a lifetime, I tugged at the woman's coat, calling her name. Mrs. Murphy, Mrs. Murphy. She drew back with an air of surprise, but her face glowed when she caught sight of the smokes. Thanks, love, you're a star. There's tenpence for your trouble, she remarked, rubbing my head. Off you go, your mammy will be looking for you now. Go on, chew, go on, she said, lighting the cigarette. Turning the corner, I overheard screams coming from the streets. I ran to the wall, stabbed my head over it, and saw the woman alone crying frantically. To our right, a youth was fleeing between passing cars with a handbag in his grip. It was the boy who stood at the bottom of our block earlier. He waved through the crowds moving between the cars and a line of workmen on the side of the road. Shouts thundered from the outlets, the flats and the workers. Some chased after him with hammers, others with clenched fists. A gang of men settled in front, but he widened the gap by bursting through the maze of angry faces. Visitors sitting in traffic stared at the sculptured boxes of concrete, the chamfered windows, protruding balconies. They looked and wondered about us, the people who lived in the sky. Chapter 8. I cringed watching him race beyond the grass and reach the place where I was cowering. His face was red. He breathed heavily, making funny movements with his mouth. I tried to move, but his gaze held me riveted to the spot like a rabbit in a snare. I could hear the rustling of shoes and a siren ringing in the distance. He was about to strike me, but I sprang to my feet and darted. My feet took me across the open space with a voice in my head saying, "Run, Georgie, run." The police car screeched. A cold sweat broke over me. I looked towards our tower. People were lining the windows and balconies. The sky was bright blue. I remember that. The door of the car slammed as the guard ran. I fired a glance over my shoulder and saw that the thief was doing the same. Another police car screeched to a halt, but the boy disappeared into the basement of the flats. I raced up the stairs, shooting past the boys and the girls singing Beatles songs until I reached the second floor. I met Fat Billy. He was standing against the wall. He called to me, "It's my birthday today, George. I make the same as you." "Happy birthday, Billy," I said, trying to catch my breath. The smell of cabbage floated along the hallway. Billy stretched flattened cardboard boxes outside the door. I picked up an old radio that was lying in the corner. Billy said his granddad won it in the war for being a hero. "I didn't know you could win radios for being a hero, Billy." "Yeah, you can, but only when they run out of medals." They must have always been running out of medals, cause Grandad has about 10,000 radios. "Really?" "Yeah. If you want, I'll ask him if he can give you one. I think he's getting another 5 next week. Then he'll have 20,000. "Wow, a real hero," I said in wonderment. "Yep, and I'm going to be a hero someday. That's what me Grandad says." Billy's ma peeped her head out of the door. "Come on, time to come in, Billy. That boy's mammy will be looking for him. Tell him to go home." She didn't have to repeat herself. I left without saying goodbye to Billy. When I reached our landing, Joseph, Tim and Sam were playing hide and seek. "George, I'm telling on you," Joseph shouted. He rushed in towards Ma and Dad, who were sitting at the kitchen table. "Ma, George was down the block on his own. Ma, 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 Ma," I shouted, reaching her before Joseph could. I told her the whole story about the woman's bag being robbed. They looked at us with their mouths opened. Dad looked over at Ma. It was one of those looks that big people have when they don't want to tell you things. "Okay, George, go out and play. You're not to go down the block on your own. Stay with Joseph," Dad said. Peter, John, Joseph and I played with Sam on the ground in front of us. Susan and a few girls came along and they joined in. I told them about the boy, the bag and the woman. Susan asked, "Was you scared, George?" "Me? Nah, I'm never scared. Me? No, never." Her eyes twinkled at me. I was sure she thought I was a hero like Billy's grandad. Only I didn't get a radio. Me grandad found me nanny under a big rock because he often asked her what rock she crawled out from. "My grandad lives in a mansion," shouted Sam. "A mansion?" we asked. "Yeah, Fatty me mansions. He owns loads." I looked to my right and saw a man. His face looked dark and nasty. A grim expression gawked at me. The youth who robbed the bag stepped out from behind him as if he was hiding under his coat. They were paying special attention to me. If my footwear had a brain of its own, it would have taken off, but my body wouldn't join in, so I did the thing that any galloping horseman would do. I froze. Then I thought, yes, I'm a warrior. And with that, I grabbed Joseph's hand and ran. That night, I crept up to the sitting room door and listened. I could hear Ma and Dad talking and moving around. The television muffled their voices. I couldn't make out what they were saying. They were speaking. I'm listening. And then I heard them. I'm telling you, Marie, what's this place going to be like in a few years? The bottom line is, it's time to go. I'll go into the corporation in the morning and see if they can move us.
Chapter 9. The weeks passed, but the blustery weather remained. The tap on the kitchen sink was dripping. The sound, like that of the clock that hung on the wall of my nanny's house in Ballymun. Ma rose from the chair, strolled over to the countertop and watched the kettle boil. From there, she picked up a brown envelope. The wooden clothes horse was full of vests and socks, so I took a pair. When Ma reached over, she flicked the envelope off the back of my head. Leave them, George. They're still wet. Her voice was sombre. There was a quietness about her that was strange. She went to the chest of drawers for a clean vests and socks. She checked my ears. Get washed before you get dressed, not the other way around. People can be poor, but a bar of soap costs nothing. The radio started singing again. I sang along with it and looked at Ma drinking a cup of tea. She opened the letter. My mind drifted. As I sat there, I thought about Upsa Daisy, my friend. His real name was Tim. He lived in the 8-story blocks close to our tower. So I left the flat and ran over to see him. When I got there, Upsa Daisy's ma was dragging her pram up the steps with a few scruffy kids around her. Her belly was fat. She worried about that because every chance she got, she rubbed it. She groaned over the smell of urine, the children, and Upsa Daisy, who she said never helped her. Her coat was long and worn. Her shoes tattered. Her world was populated with boys. They weren't big like me. Babies. That's what I called them. One pulled the other one's hair while another child scratched the nose of the kid beside him. They cried and stared in a dreamlike fashion. As soon as the dreaming was over, the pulling and scratching broke out again. The mother's mind seemed to wander. There was sorrow in her thoughts. Sadness shouted from her expression. In a fit of trembling, she sank into the corner, her eyelids puffed from everyday tears. A voice rang in song. It silenced every other noise on the cold concrete steps and the howling of the infant's cry. Well, there you are, mate. Oh, there you are, me pal. Sure, life is good and all is well when a man can call another friend. The voice belonged to Upsa Daisy's dad. He danced and tipped his heels together. The mother screamed, "You lunatic! You drunken lunatic!" Well, how things have changed. In my younger days, a woman wouldn't talk like that. She'd get a good doing over such talk, he slurred. He fell, but the wall held him up. Step by step he walked up and down. Upsa Daisy's ma stood motionless, as if in an apologetic stance for bellowing her harsh words. Her skin burned hotter than a stove. They didn't always live here. They neither did we. I remember the big house we came from. Our room was in the basement. We had an enormous wall outside our door. There was a tree. Joseph and I would play at that tree. Tim lived on the 3rd floor of his block. We lived on the 10th of ours. A new family was moving in on the 4th floor, just above Tim's family. They passed us on the stairs, carrying chairs and a small telly. "Me brother's in New York. He asked me to come over," said Tim's ma, pulling a letter from her pocket. "Well, what? We'll talk about it tomorrow," Tim's dad began to sing. "Oh, tomorrow, tomorrow, there's always tomorrow. Tomorrow!" screamed Tim's ma. "Tomorrow!"
The man carrying the telly throws his eyes in the air and shouts at Tim's dad, "Get out of me way, you half a tick, or you might not see tomorrow." I could see Tim's dad wasn't scared. Some people, especially big people who wear suits, often look scared when they come into our flats. I don't know why, but I see it in their faces. I asked Mar about this. She said they must be afraid of heights. I didn't know who Heights was, and I was glad I never met him, because I was fully assured I'd be afraid of him as well. Two girls came onto the stairwell and bounced their balls off the walls singing. There was an old woman who lived in the woods. Wheela, wheela, whyla. There was an old woman who lived in the woods down by the riverside. She had a baby 3 months old. Wheela, wheela, whyla. She had a baby 3 months old down by the riverside. Tim's drunken father sang a song and pointed his finger at his son. "Stay where you are." Tim gripped my hand, he winked and smiled as we glided by the mother, the father, and a heap of screaming babies. We descended into the unknown world of rebellion. We transgressed the commands of the big people who stood on a dark, sunless stairwell in a cold concrete block. Tim and I had played together in the basement. We could do what we liked, because tomorrow was never going to come. It was nowhere near us, far from our minds. Big people lived in their tomorrows, while we played in our nows. The darkness on the walls shouted at us. The smell of the large bins was the same as ours. There was rubbish on the ground, including papers, bottle tops, and used bags that were once worth something useful. Maybe, but now they were lying there on the streets, good for nothing. I could hear the mother above us making dinner, scraping off pots, the laying down of plates. The mother shouted, "Put that knife away, it's too small. Use a bread knife." I thought about the woman who lived in the woods, the one by the riverside. Was the woods near? If they were, could I sneak up to them? Ma would not allow it, but I thought, maybe if I crawled up close enough to spy on her, me ma wouldn't mind. I pictured her a big, large woman, with a dress and a fat belly, the fattest you'd ever seen. She'd have a pimple on her neck, the size of a football. When she spoke, fire would come out of her mouth. "Come on, let's go over to your block," Tim said. I did not disagree. He took hold of my hand and we ran, all mucked up and scraped knees, happy faces and Tim's runny nose. I looked and saw his mother watching him from the window, but we raced towards the path outside mine. We talked with Susan. Well, I did. For whatever reason, she didn't look at Tim. Me ma said, "We live here, we lived there, and we lived everywhere. Everywhere. Everywhere you look. Do you like porridge, George? We love it. We eat bowls of it. We eat porridge in the morning, during the day and at night. Me dad says it's great for you. He says it puts muscles on your muscles. Take a look." She lifted her arm like Popeye. Then she fled. I gazed over the balcony as we descended up into my room. Then we came back down. Cigarette smoke trailed from the workers' lips as the clatter of their shoes announced their arrival home from work. The girls sat on swings, cars passed on the street. I thought of Jack in the Beanstalk and wondered if he felt the same as me as he climbed the giant tree. The towers loomed high above the pavement. Those concrete trees never slumbered or slept, because voices kept them awake. The voices go from window to window and balcony to balcony, and the woman chatting, talking at the wall. When it was time for Tim to go home, I watched him run Under the illumination of the evening light, the women who sat on their chairs behind me had cheerful faces. Together they talked of the comfort their new dwellings brought, remembering the old damp rotten houses they'd left. The sunbeams embraced them like an admirer, their eyes burning like the flames on a candle. Those wide awake dreamers nestled under the busy block of flats. They were the flowers that slept in the darkness, and now they had the power to open their eyes. I never forgot that family. The woman on the stairwell, the offence burning in her face, the faded coat, the steps in front rising higher than a church steeple, the evening sounds announcing the close of the day. Chapter 10. When I got back to the flat, Ma told me she'd gone to see a man called Charlie Haughty a few weeks earlier. She asked him if he could give us a house. "Leave it with me, Mrs. Fitzgerald," he replied, gently tipping her hand. "I've wonderful news," Ma said as she glanced in the mirror. "Quick, George, run over to Mrs. Crosby and tell her I want her. There's a good boy." There was something up. She never left an untidy kitchen. Her golden rule was never leave a milk bottle on the table and put the milk in a jug. Ma said it was a sign of poverty. When Mrs. Crosby visited, she was wearing a long cream coat and a scarf on her head. "What's up, Marie? What's up?" "There's something I have to tell you," she said, squeezing the letter. Mrs. Crosby looked puzzled. "We're moving. I got a letter from the corporation. Isn't that great?" "Ah, Marie, that's amazing news. Does Georgie know?" The word moving sent alarm bells ringing in my head. "No, he's at work. The letter came after he left. And believe it or not, he was just saying that he might go in to see them today." "Well, that's if you got a chance." When Mrs. Crosby had gone, Ma called us into the sitting room. She sat on the edge of the chair, unable to speak with excitement. "I've great news. We're moving to a new house." We were not impressed. We did not want to leave the flat. "Our friends are here," we protested. "Well, you can visit them, and just think about it. You'll have a front and back garden. No more climbing stairwells or waiting on lifts that never work." When Dad came home, he sat down, took off his jacket and pulled off his jumper. His armpits were dark after a long day's work. "Is that heat on, Marie? It's boiling in here," he said, while fanning his face with the evening newspaper. The heat in the flats were underground heating. Some people use them to dry their clothes on the floor. I know Billy's ma did. Despite the heat, it was bitterly cold night outside. I could see the frost gathering on the glass. Ma was standing at the cooker with her back to him. She turned and caught Dad's glare. "Is there something wrong?" he asked worriedly. Ma didn't answer. I was just about to blurt it out when Ma drew the chair towards her and sat beside him. "Is there something wrong?" Dad said again, placing the elbow on the table. "Yeah, well, no. Look, we're moving," she replied excitedly, handing him the letter. With those words, he pushed his tea away and jumped to his feet. He took her in his arms and engaged in a warm embrace before dancing around the kitchen. "George, open the door a little. The heat in here would kill you." "But Dad, I'm watching Pippi Longstockings. The clangers are on in a minute." I walked out and hung my head over the balcony. I glanced at the flats and all the washing that lined each one. I listened to the sounds of the streets. Boys shouted up to their mothers, who hung over the balconies, calling them. The cold made me shiver. "Come in out of the cold," Ma said. "It's not good for you to go from heat to cold." "Okay, Ma, I'll be in a minute." I took a lungful of air and stared up at the moon. It was ever so white, with a real peaceful face. The friendly moon alone in the sky, set among thousands of stars. He He's quiet, bright, daring the blackness to overcome him. Goodbye, Mr. Moon. Goodbye. Chapter 11. I tell stories to myself in my head, sometimes in the morning or on the way to school, but mostly at night in bed while I stare at the ceiling. I like my stories. Yes, I like them a lot. Then I go to sleep. I rub my eyes, yank back the blankets and rush towards the window. It was morning. I could see the pathway we took to school, the tower in front, the flats behind, filling the skyline, and beyond them was the grassy wasteland that had brown trails of earth cut across them. It was a wintry morning. The bedroom door opened. It was Ma. Right, boys, it's time to get up. We have to leave shortly and say goodbye to Tim, Sam, and Billy. Joseph and I were 8 years of age. Pat was 4. To say goodbye to the only home we'd known was sad. When Joseph and I had washed and finished our breakfast, we walked into our bedroom. Joseph said we were moving because Dad got a different job. I agreed. Then he said it was because I'd seen a bag being robbed. Marie, Marie, Dad called. We dashed onto the balcony when we heard Dad shout. Make sure you have everything. I'm watching the furniture. Tony'll be here soon. Okay. Well, Dad was outside. Ma came into the room carrying Pat. She was singing and tiddling him. Secretly, I felt excited, wondering what our new house would look like. But Joseph's unhappiness kept me quiet. Ma closed the hall door and pushed the key through the letterbox, and we headed over to say goodbye to Mrs. Crosby. While they sniffed and cried, my brother and me tumbled down the stairs one last time. When Tony, our father's workmate, pulled up in a blue Ford van on that freezing winter's morning, Joseph and I raced over to him. Well, boys, this is a marvellous day, he said, laughing, rubbing his hands over our heads. Tony's voice had all the qualities of an upper-class man, although his wagon had a lot of catching up to do. The wind blew across the neighbourhood. Small pieces of paper ran along the street. They clung to our feet like elastic bands that wouldn't let go. We shook them off and ran to the corner, looking over our shoulders at Dad and Tony loading the van. Let's play hide and seek, I suggested, tipping Joe's head and running towards the bins. I slid behind him and held my nose. Joe squatted on his hunkers, and just by moving slightly I saw Pat. He was standing on the street in a blue jumper. His dark curly hair looked like an afro. A mirror of ice lodged on the surface beneath me. I placed my fingers on the frozen concrete and scaled the wall. I reached the door and shifted inside. There was noise rising from the ground, like friction of leather shoes scraping on the tiles. I heard heavy breathing of boys fighting. I listened with interest as I crept into the dark hallway. When I looked in, I saw 2 boys fighting, and I detected a wailing cry. It was coming from a small fat woman. She looked like a washerwoman dressed in an apron. The boys were gaunt and dressed in dirty clothes. They had bristles for hair. A middle-aged man who was as long as a tree stood between them. He had a long coat and a cap. He looked drunk. One boy slapped the man, and when he got no response, he kicked the woman. The man fell to his knees. I thought he was going to say a prayer, but he cried instead. The heavy-set woman wailed. The man then rose and rushed towards the boy and lifted him into the air so that his feet couldn't touch the ground. Then he walked him straight into a wall. My name came to me in a whisper. I spun and gazed at Joseph. Come on, man, they're looking for you. We have to go. So we backed out of the darkness and into the light. My brothers turned the corner. I climbed the stairs to the second floor. Billy was sitting on the ground playing with his old radio. He looked at me. "George." "Hush, Billy. I'm not supposed to be here." He sprang to his feet. We stood face to face. "I'm going to my new house today. You'll get a new house too, Billy." "Will I?" "Yeah, we all will." He flung his arms around me. "The teacher was mean to you, Georgie." I was sad. "You're a good friend, Billy." I ran to the door and waved. He waved back, and I descended the stairs one last time. When the van was finally packed, Joseph and I sat in the back and patting Ma's knee. Crowds of kids gathered, filling the streets and the balconies. All the women were waving from the windows, wishing us well. I noticed Billy among them. A tear fell on my cheek. When I looked again, I saw him wipe a tear from his face with the back of his hand. I pressed my face against the window and waved. I'm sure I saw him mouth the words, "Goodbye, George." "Goodbye, Billy. Sorry for calling you fat," I said to the glass in front of me. "Right, George, it's time to go," Tony said to Dad. "Where is it again, George?" "Finglas South, Tony. I'll show you." Tony let down the handbrake, looked in the mirror and said, "Right, Finglas South, here we come," with the OJs singing Love Train. Chapter 12. On Dublin's north side there is a river called Clearwater. To the north of its banks there is a sprawling housing estate of 2 to 3 bedroom homes to hard working class families. In the early 70s it had high unemployment rates. It was an area of wide streets, lanes and alleys. It was also a place I'd call home. The name of this neighbourhood is Finglas South. This is where I would spend the next 30 years of my life. From my bedroom I could see the houses remained cloaked under heaven's view. Sleet had fallen. The rooftops were white. The crowded roads beneath my window had men, women and happy children making their way along the slippery road towards their new homes. Lines of cars and vans arrived and parked on the pavement. A throng of people, bulky men, intermixing with a few women as they helped one another on the virgin soil of Finglas South. Joe called, I heard him, but I kept my eyes on the road and watched a man sitting on a cart dressed in a short jacket and cap. He was gazing busily at nothing, and he didn't notice that 3 boys were walking through the crowd, tossing the hats of the smaller kids. The ringleader stopped and lay hold of his companion's shoulder. The boys looked at one another and fell into a crawling position until they reached the cart. 3 pair of hands stretched up and pulled the bag to the ground. The old man turned his head, gave a shout and jumped off the cart. The boys let out a cry. The ringleader laughed as they approached the corner before vanishing. Joe called again. I grabbed my coat and hat and rushed down the stairs, following him out the door, while Pat trailed behind. Ma gave us 50 pence, Joe said. Great, let's get down to the little shop van down here. Back then we didn't have shops in Finglas South. We had vans that acted like shops. That's where we headed. The streets were alive with people who had come from the tenements of inner city Dublin and the flat complexes of Ballymun. I crossed the road and noticed a gang of youths leaning against the wall. They smoked cigarettes, spat on the ground, turned towards us, but we kept walking. The shop was a run-down van. The owner parked it beside a wall. Blocked windows shut out everything, including the light, well, except the middle one that acted as a hatch door. Inside, the makeshift shelves had bars of soap, washing powder and sweets. On the counter were a few apple boxes. They were red and green apples, and toffee ones too. Joe crouched on a rock, chewing on a toffee bar. I stood gazing at the streets, sucking on a lolly, wondering how far away Ballymun was, and if I'd ever see Billy, John or Peter again. Can you count to 10? Joe asked Pat, as he bit down on the last piece of toffee. You just want to know, Pat replied in long-drawn words. Well, I knew how to count to 10 when I was 5 years old, Joe replied, sticking out his tongue. While my brothers were sticking out their tongues to one another, a boy walked by. Then he passed again, stopping every now and again, looking at us. I eyes and returned the look. He was a lean boy with freckled face and brown hair, dressed in a monkey hat and dark corduroy trousers. "Hello," he said as he crossed to our side of the street. "Hello," I replied. "Will you be my friend, 'cause I live up there?" he said, pointing towards the corner house. "Yeah," Pat replied, "and we live down there, and we have lollipops and teats." "Me name is Thomas," he said, reaching out his hand. "I'm George. This is me twin brother Joseph, and the other fella is our brother Pat. From now on you'll be known as Thomas." The freckle-faced kid laughed. "Yeah, and you'll be known as Twinny." Another freckle-faced kid jumped off a passing cart. He had wild sticky up hair and a long coat and trousers that were too short because you could see his stockings. He looked into our faces, tipped my shoulder, seized Thomas' hat and ran like blazes. "He has your hat, let's go after him," Joseph shouted, and off we went, running through the lanes and backyards. The noise of the streets were barely audible as we scurried up a lane. The icy wind now carried a chilling sound, piling sleet into the corner. We took a deep breath and slid under a fence. The boy was running as fast as he could. He stopped and rested his hand on a wall, inhaled deeply and burst in through a back door. The four of us raced after him. He bounced over wall after wall and found himself in another lane. He moved to the right, backwards, and then stopped. The boy crouched, jumped, and tried to run, but we grabbed him, pinning him to a wall. When I looked at him, I noticed he had an unusual way of standing. His head was held back so that his chin was sticking up in the air, and he stared down at us. When I looked at the boys, I saw they were all doing the same thing, staring up, chin sticking up, and even little Pat was doing it. The silence was broken when Pat said, "How long have you got to do this and stand like this? Because I'm getting a pain." A winter wind broke through the clouds and casting a goat-like shadow on the wall. "Here, I have it. Goaty. That's it. Goaty," I said. "Your name will be Goaty." The lips separated and a smile appeared in the strange boy's face. "Yeah, and what's yours names?" he asked, still holding his head in the air. "I'm Twinny. My brother is the other Twinny, and that's Thomas," I said. Pat was dressed in a war suit that he got for Christmas. "Yeah, and from now on we'll call him Nazi," Goaty said, pointing to Pat. We shook hands and skipped out of the lane onto the streets, the Twinnies, Thomas, Goaty and Nazi. A woman called us over and handed us a few apples. Pat skipped ahead of us, while the four of us walked with our shoulders held back, heads in the air, passing cars, vans, men and women and a gang of boys in the corner. We played together until Ma called us in for our tea. Then we took turns running up and down the stairs. It was our first night in our new home, with our very own stairs that nobody else could walk on but us.